Just one day before my wedding, my father called with a message that shattered my world. "I am not walking you down the aisle," he told me, his voice cold and matter of fact. "Your sister says it would upset her." My mother then took the phone and agreed, telling me to just walk alone because it was not a big deal. She said I was 35 and did not need to be given away. On my wedding day, I did not walk alone. When the heavy oak doors opened and the guests saw who was holding my arm, my father, who was sitting in the very back row, went completely pale. "I am Maya, 35 years old, and a senior director in commercial real estate acquisitions. For my entire life, I have played the role of the reliable, independent, and ultimately invisible older daughter in my family. I spent my 20s and early 30s building a formidable career, negotiating multi-million-dollar property deals across the country, and securing my own financial independence. I bought my own home, paid off my own student loans, and never asked my parents for a single dime. You would think that kind of ambition would make a family proud. In my family, it only made me a threat. The morning before my wedding, I was standing in the center of a breathtaking historic estate in Atlanta. The venue was exactly what I had always dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and the arched windows let in beams of natural light that illuminated the polished hardwood floors. I had rented the entire estate for the weekend, paying for every single detail out of my own pocket, using my corporate bonuses. I was surrounded by event staff, reviewing the final floral arrangements. White orchids, lush hydrangeas, and trailing greenery were being meticulously placed on the tables. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, and for a fleeting moment I felt a profound sense of peace. I was marrying the love of my life in 24 hours. Everything was perfect. Then my phone rang. The caller ID flashed with my father Calvin's name. I smiled, assuming he was calling to ask about the rehearsal dinner schedule or to check if I needed help running any last-minute errands. I swiped to answer and pressed the phone to my ear. "Hey, Dad," I said cheerfully. "We are just finishing up the floral arrangements. The venue looks incredible." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. When my father finally spoke, there was no warmth in his voice, no greeting, no excitement for his eldest daughter. "Maya, I am not walking you down the aisle tomorrow." The words did not process immediately. I stood there watching a florist arrange a cascade of white orchids and blinked. "What did you say?" "I cannot walk you down the aisle." He repeated, his tone laced with an irritating blend of exhaustion and annoyance. "Your sister is having a severe anxiety episode right now. She has been crying in her childhood bedroom all morning." I gripped the phone tighter, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. "Chloe is 32 years old, Dad. Why is she crying in her bedroom the day before my wedding?" "Because of all this?" Calvin snapped, as if I were purposely being dense. "This massive, over-the-top wedding you are throwing. You know we paid for Chloe's wedding at the country club 3 years ago. We took out a second mortgage to give her a beautiful day. And now you go and rent out this historic estate, flying in premium flowers, hiring a live orchestra. You are deliberately trying to overshadow her. It is insensitive, Maya." Chloe feels completely humiliated. She says your wedding is designed to make hers look cheap, and me walking you down the aisle in that grand setting would just be a public endorsement of your showing off. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. My sister Chloe had always been the golden child. She was the one who followed the exact path my parents dictated. She was conventionally pretty, socially aggressive, and always needed to be the center of attention. When I was studying late into the night for my degrees, Chloe was networking at social mixers. When I got my first major promotion, my parents barely acknowledged it because Chloe had just announced her engagement. Every milestone of my life had been pushed aside to make room for Chloe's feelings. But this was my wedding day. "Dad, I paid for this wedding myself," I said, striving to keep my voice level and professional. "I worked 80-hour weeks for years to afford this. I am not trying to overshadow anyone. I am just celebrating my marriage. You are really telling me you are going to abandon me on my wedding day because Chloe is jealous of my floral budget?" Before he could answer, there was a shuffling sound on the line, and my mother Brenda snatched the phone. Her voice came through sharp and commanding, entirely lacking the maternal comfort one might expect the day before a wedding. "Maya, stop being so difficult," Brenda demanded. "You need to be reasonable about this. You know perfectly well that Liam's family is flying in from Boston this afternoon." Liam was Chloe's husband. He was a white, arrogant, condescending man who came from what my parents believed was old money. My parents absolutely worshipped Liam. They treated him like a prize, a status symbol that elevated our family's social standing. They constantly tiptoed around him, eager to impress his supposedly elite, wealthy relatives. "What does Liam's family have to do with my wedding?" I asked, the familiar sting of rejection burning in my throat. "It has everything to do with it," Brenda retorted impatiently. "Liam's parents are wealthy, traditional people. They judge everything. If they come to your wedding and see this massive, extravagant display, they are going to look down on Chloe. They are going to wonder why Liam's wife had a smaller, less impressive wedding. We cannot have Liam's family thinking Chloe is the lesser sister. We cannot let her look like second best in front of her white in-laws. It would destroy her confidence." I stood completely still in the middle of the ballroom. The event staff continued buzzing around me, unaware that my mother had just asked me to shrink my entire existence so my sister would not feel insecure in front of her arrogant husband's family. "So I have to punish myself," I said quietly. "I have to walk down the aisle alone, unloved and unsupported by my own parents, just to protect Chloe's fragile ego." "You are 35 years old," Maya, my mother, scoffed. "You do not need a father to give you away. You are an independent woman. Just walk alone. It is not a big deal. You are making a mountain out of a molehill. Julian's family will be there, and it is not like they know the difference between a high society wedding and a backyard barbecue anyway." The casual insult thrown at my fiancé made my blood run cold. Julian was the most incredible man I had ever met. He was the director of an inner-city youth nonprofit dedicating his life to helping marginalized teenagers find pathways to college and careers. My parents mocked him relentlessly for it. Because he did not wear designer suits or brag about corporate mergers, they deemed him broke and ambitionless. They constantly compared him to Liam, making snide remarks at every holiday dinner about how Julian needed to find a real job so he could actually support me. They had no idea who Julian really was, and they certainly had no idea who they were actually insulting. "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave. "You are telling me that you and Dad are prioritizing Liam's parents over your own flesh and blood daughter. You are telling me that my father is stripping away a moment I have dreamed about since I was a little girl, all to appease Chloe." "Do not use that tone with me," Brenda snapped defensively. "We are trying to keep the peace in this family. Chloe is delicate right now. You have always been the strong one. You can handle this. We will still be at the ceremony, but your father is not walking you down the aisle, and that is final. Accept it and move on." A decade ago, I would have cried. I would have begged. I would have offered to scale back the wedding, to cancel the orchestra, to do whatever it took to earn their conditional love. I would have twisted myself into knots trying to prove that I was worthy of the same affection they showered so easily on Chloe. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a woman who had negotiated against ruthless corporate sharks and built an empire of my own. I had spent years in therapy, unlearning the toxic family dynamics that told me I was only valuable when I was accommodating their dysfunction. I looked up at the stunning vaulted ceiling of the venue I had paid for. I looked at the beautiful life I had built with my own two hands, and then I made a choice. "Understood," I said softly. What Brenda sounded momentarily confused by my lack of resistance. I said, "I understand perfectly, Mom. I understand exactly where I stand in this family. See you tomorrow." I ended the call before she could say another word. I lowered the phone, my hands trembling slightly, not from sorrow, but from a profound white-hot clarity. The final thread tying me to their approval had just snapped. "Hey, beautiful." I turned around. Julian was walking through the grand entryway of the ballroom. He was wearing dark jeans and a simple fitted sweater, looking effortlessly handsome. His presence immediately grounded me. Julian had a quiet, steady strength about him. He never needed to be the loudest person in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. He walked over to me, taking in the rigid set of my shoulders and the intensity in my eyes. He reached out and gently cupped my face, his thumb stroking my cheekbone. "What happened?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath and leaned into his touch. "My dad just called. He is not walking me down the aisle tomorrow. Chloe is throwing a fit because our wedding is too nice and my parents do not want to embarrass her in front of Liam's family. They told me to walk alone." Julian did not react with shock. He did not raise his voice or express outrage. Instead, a slow, quiet, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was a look my family had never seen on him. It was the look of a man who possessed immense power and knew exactly when to use it. "They told you to walk alone," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, my mom said I should just handle it because I am the strong one. And she threw in a lovely little insult about your family, not knowing the difference between high society and a barbecue." Julian chuckled, a rich, deep sound that held no amusement. He kissed my forehead, lingering there for a moment before pulling back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Give me 1 second," he said. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear. The person on the other end answered almost immediately. "Hey, Julian," said, his tone shifting into something remarkably authoritative. "Yeah, it is me. Listen, there has been a change of plans for the ceremony tomorrow. Maya needs you." He listened for a few seconds, his dark eyes fixed on mine. "I know you were planning to stay under the radar until the reception," Julian continued. "But her father just pulled out. He chose the sister." "Yeah, I know. So I need you front and center tomorrow. When those doors open, I need everyone in that room to know exactly who stands behind her." Another brief pause. Julian smiled warmly at whatever the person on the other end said. "Thank you," Julian replied. "See you tonight." He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He wrapped both arms around my waist, pulling me against his chest. The tension that had been gripping my muscles began to melt away in his embrace. "You will not walk alone, Maya," he said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I promise you. When those doors open tomorrow, you are going to have the most powerful escort in the city, holding your arm." I looked up at the man I was going to marry. My family thought he was just a humble non-profit worker. They thought he was a charity case they could look down on to make themselves feel superior. They had spent 3 years mocking him, belittling his community work, and comparing him unfavorably to Chloe's supposedly elite husband. They had absolutely no idea who Julian really was. And they had no idea that by abandoning me on my wedding day, they had just set the stage for their own absolute destruction. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Let them come tomorrow, I thought. Let them sit in the back row and wait for my humiliation. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong daughter. The heavy brass handles of the ballroom doors rattled, shattering the quiet sanctuary Julian and I had just created. The doors pushed open, and the sound of sharp, frantic heels echoed across the polished hardwood floor. It was my sister Chloe, flanked by her husband Liam. They had not been invited to the venue setup. I had explicitly requested a closed-door session with my vendors, but boundaries were a foreign concept to my family, especially when they felt they were losing control. Chloe marched toward us, her face arranged in a mask of exaggerated performative concern. She wore a designer silk blouse that looked perfectly steamed, clutching a pristine leather handbag like a shield. Liam trailed half a step behind her, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored chinos. Liam was the embodiment of what my parents worshipped. He was white blonde and carried himself with the languid, unbothered arrogance of a man who had never been told no. My parents loved to remind everyone that Liam descended from generational wealth, a fading trust fund family that had supposedly shaped the Northeast banking sector decades ago. "Maya, we just had to come check on you," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Mom called me in an absolute panic. She said you were being completely unreasonable on the phone and that you were upset about Dad's decision. I told her I would come down here and make sure you were not having a breakdown." I stepped out of Julian's embrace and smoothed the front of my blazer. "I am perfectly fine, Chloe. As you can see, I am finalizing the floral arrangements. There is no breakdown happening here." Liam let out a low, whistling breath as he looked up at the vaulted ceilings and the towering crystal chandeliers. He did not look at me. I was too busy evaluating the room, his eyes calculating the square footage and the cost of the imported hydrangeas. "Quite the setup you have got going on here," Liam said, finally turning his gaze to Julian. His lips curved into a tight, patronizing smile. "I have to admit I am surprised. I did not realize the inner-city youth charity sector was handing out bonuses these days. What did you do, Julian? Take out a second mortgage on that little townhouse of yours?" Or did you just max out a few high-interest credit cards to keep up appearances? The casual cruelty of his words hung in the air. It was a classic Liam move, wrapping a profound insult in the guise of a casual joke. He loved nothing more than trying to make Julian feel small, leaning heavily into classist microaggressions to assert his perceived dominance. He wanted Julian to feel like a trespasser in a world of wealth. Julian did not flinch. He did not tighten his jaw or raise his voice. He simply smiled, a relaxed, easy expression that radiated pure confidence. We budgeted carefully, Liam. You would be surprised what you can afford when you manage your resources with integrity. Liam scoffed, shaking his head as if Julian were a naive child. Just be careful, man. Predatory loans are no joke. My family's wealth manager always says that people who do not understand money are the fastest ones to lose it. I would hate to see you two starting your marriage drowning in debt, just because you wanted to pretend you belong in a place like this. I observed Liam quietly, letting his arrogant words wash over me without reacting. 5 years ago, his condescension might have made me defensive. Now my trained eyes caught the subtle telling details he tried so hard to hide. Liam casually checked the time, flashing his watch so the light would catch the rose gold bezel. It was a Rolex Daytona. A beautiful timepiece, but my corporate acquisitions career required me to know the luxury market intimately. It was a model from 2 seasons ago. More importantly, the band had visible scuff marks along the clasp, and the polish was fading on the edges. For a man who constantly bragged about his exponentially growing trust fund and his family's boundless capital, he was wearing depreciating assets and failing to maintain them. It was a subtle, unmistakable hint of financial strain. Real wealth, the kind of wealth I dealt with every single day, did not need to shout. Liam was screaming. Chloe stepped closer, running her fingers over one of the white orchid centerpieces with a critical eye. She tugged at a delicate petal, almost snapping it off the stem. "Well, the flowers are certainly loud," Chloe remarked, her nose wrinkling slightly. "It is a bit much, do you not think? It borders on tacky." When Liam and I got married at the country club, we kept things elegant and understated. Dad always says that true class whispers. This venue just feels like it is trying entirely too hard to prove something. She was projecting her own deep-seated insecurities onto my wedding day. She could not stand that the venue I had secured with my own hard-earned money eclipsed the country club wedding our father had financed for her. "The orchids stay exactly as they are," I said, my voice cutting through the space with cold corporate precision. "The design has already been finalized and paid for. I did not ask for your creative input, Chloe." Chloe pulled her hand back, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "You do not have to be so hostile, Maya. I am just trying to help you avoid embarrassing yourself. Dad is already stressed enough about tomorrow. He is genuinely worried about how Liam's parents are going to react to all this unnecessary flashiness. You know they come from a very traditional background." Liam wrapped an arm around Chloe's waist, pulling her close in a show of unified superiority. "My parents have very refined tastes, Maya. They are used to a certain standard of society. Chloe just wants to make sure you do not look like new money trying to buy class. We are just looking out for you." I looked at the two of them standing there, wrapped in their delusions of grandeur, and their desperate need to pull me down to make themselves feel taller. They truly believed they held the high ground. They truly believed Julian was a struggling social worker, and I was just an insecure older sister desperate for their validation. "I appreciate the concern, Liam," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and pleasant. "But I assure you, Julian and I are entirely comfortable with our financial decisions. Your parents will just have to endure the evening as best as they can." Liam let out a short, dismissive laugh, clearly taking my calmness as submission. "Just do not come crying to my father-in-law for a bailout when the venue sends you the final damages bill," he muttered. Chloe sighed, playing the role of the exhausted peacemaker. "Anyway, we just came to see if you needed help cleaning up. Since Dad is not walking you down the aisle, I assume you are going to be a mess tonight. We will see you at the rehearsal dinner. Try not to be late. Dad hates waiting." They turned and walked out of the ballroom together, their footsteps echoing with unearned authority. Julian stood beside me, watching the heavy doors swing shut behind them. He slid his hand into mine, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "They have absolutely no idea," Julian murmured, a hint of dark amusement lacing his voice. Not a single clue, I replied, turning my gaze back to the stunning floral arches framing the altar. And tomorrow we are going to let them figure it out the hard way. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung shut, sealing Julian and me back in our quiet sanctuary. But the peace only lasted for a fraction of a second. A sharp prickle of intuition flared at the base of my neck. I knew my sister. Chloe never retreated unless she had secured some petty vindictive victory on her way out. I glanced down at the digital floor plan on my tablet. The master seating chart. The massive custom frosted acrylic board had just been delivered and positioned in the grand foyer right outside the ballroom doors. It detailed the exact placement for all 300 guests, complete with hand-calligraphed names and delicate wax seals. I squeezed Julian's hand, signaling for him to wait, and pushed the ballroom doors back open. My instincts were flawless. Chloe and Liam had not left the venue. They were standing in front of the grand seating display in the foyer. Liam was holding Chloe's designer handbag, while Chloe was actively picking at the edge of a placement card, attempting to peel it off the acrylic board. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked, my voice slicing through the empty foyer like a tailored knife. Chloe jumped her hand, snatching back from the board. She spun around, her cheeks flushing a dull, guilty red before she quickly rearranged her features into a mask of indignant authority. "I am fixing this disaster of a seating chart, Maya," she said, crossing her arms defensively. "I was looking at where you put Liam's parents. Table 12. Are you out of your mind? You placed the Pembertons at table 12 halfway across the room, while Julian's random relatives are sitting at table 2, right next to the sweetheart table." I walked slowly toward her, the heels of my pumps clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I stopped 2 feet away, invading her personal space just enough to make her instinctively step back. "Julian's family is the family of the groom," I stated, enunciating each word as if speaking to a slow child. "It is customary for the groom's immediate family to sit at the VIP tables. Liam's parents are the in-laws of the bride's sister. Table 12 is an exceptionally generous placement for extended family guests." Liam scoffed, stepping forward to defend his bruised ego. "Extended family. Maya, my parents are prominent fixtures in the Northeast financial sector. They are flying down here as a favor to your father. They are accustomed to a certain level of respect and visibility at high society events. You cannot stick them in the middle of the room like commoners, while Julian's public school teacher aunts and social worker cousins take up the prime real estate." Chloe nodded, vigorously emboldened by her husband's arrogant entitlement. "Exactly. It is embarrassing, Maya. Dad would be mortified if the Pembertons felt slighted. I am just swapping them. I am moving Julian's people to table 42, right by the kitchen swinging doors. They will not mind. They are used to being in the background anyway. It makes much more sense to have real wealth sitting at the front where the event photographers can capture them." I looked at the acrylic board. She had already managed to peel off the card for Julian's aunt and was reaching for the Pemberton card to physically swap their locations. She was casually, unapologetically trying to erase Julian's family from the place of honor to elevate her white husband's relatives entirely because she believed her proximity to Liam's supposed wealth made her superior. For 3 decades, my parents had allowed Chloe to physically and emotionally bulldoze her way through my life, rearranging my achievements and my boundaries to suit her comfort. She actually believed she could do the same thing to my wedding. "Do not touch that board again," I said. My tone was not loud. I did not yell. In commercial real estate acquisitions, you learn very quickly that raising your voice is a sign of lost control. True power is perfectly quiet. It was the exact same tone I used when dismantling hostile takeover attempts in corporate boardrooms. Chloe's hand froze in midair. She looked at me, her eyes widening slightly as the temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You do not get to dictate the terms of an event you did not finance." I continued, my gaze locking onto hers with unblinking intensity. "You do not get to walk into a venue I paid for, look at a seating chart I designed, and decide that your husband's parents are more valuable than the family of the man I am marrying. Julian's family sits at table 2 because they are beloved, respected, and essential to our lives. Your husband's parents sit at table 12 because that is exactly where they belong." "Maya, you are being completely unreasonable." Chloe stammered, her fake confidence cracking under the weight of my stare. "Liam's mother is going to throw a fit. She expects VIP treatment. You are deliberately trying to humiliate us. I am doing no such thing, I replied smoothly. I am organizing a structured event. But since you are so concerned about the Pembertons feeling slighted, let me make the parameters crystal clear for you right now. I stepped closer, forcing Chloe to press her back against the display easel. Guests sit exactly where they are assigned, I said, leaning in, so only she and Liam could hear the lethal promise in my voice. They do not request upgrades. They do not rearrange place cards. They sit where I put them, or they do not sit at all. If I see Liam's parents or you or anyone else trying to commandeer a table that does not belong to them tomorrow, I will not cause a scene. I will simply have my private security team escort you out of the venue, and you can explain to the Pembertons why they are spending the evening standing in the parking lot. Liam's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. You would not dare kick my parents out. Do you have any idea who they are? I turned my gaze to Liam, sweeping my eyes up and down his slightly rumpled outfit and resting pointedly on his outdated scuffed watch. I know exactly who they are, Liam, I said, allowing a razor-thin smile to touch my lips. And more importantly, I know exactly who I am. This is not a negotiation. The seating chart is finalized. Now put the card back. Chloe's breath hitched. She looked at Liam for support, but Liam was suddenly very interested in staring at the marble floor, clearly unwilling to test the threat of private security. With trembling fingers, Chloe pressed the wax-sealed card for Julian's aunt back onto the acrylic board. She smoothed it down, her movements jerky and defeated. You are going to regret this, Maya, Chloe whispered, her voice shaking with toxic, resentful tears. When Dad finds out how you are treating us, he is going to be furious. I stepped back, smoothing my blazer once again, completely unaffected by her manufactured victimhood. Dad's emotional state is not my responsibility. You came here to check on me, Chloe. Consider your check complete. Now the exit is right behind you. Chloe grabbed Liam's arm, and the two of them practically fled toward the main entrance, pushing through the heavy glass doors and disappearing into the warm Atlanta afternoon. I stood in the foyer alone for a moment, adjusting the slightly crooked placement card Chloe had tampered with. My heart was beating in a steady, controlled rhythm. For 35 years, my family had banked on my compliance. They had relied on my desire to keep the peace, assuming I would always swallow my pride to accommodate their aggressive entitlement. They thought they could bully me into submission on the eve of my own wedding. But I was no longer playing their game. The board was set, the pieces were locked in place, and as I turned to head back into the ballroom to rejoin Julian, I knew the real storm was just beginning to gather. The quiet in the foyer lasted barely a minute before the heavy glass doors of the main entrance swung open again. Julian had just stepped out of the ballroom to join me, his warm hand settling on the small of my back. We both turned toward the entrance. The footsteps echoing across the marble floor were heavy, hurried, and completely devoid of the grace this venue demanded. It was my father. Calvin always prided himself on presenting a flawless corporate image. He was a regional vice president at a mid-sized commercial logistics firm, a title he wore like a crown and wielded like a weapon at every family gathering. He usually moved with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he owned every room he walked into. But today he looked entirely different. His expensive silk tie was slightly askew. A thin, nervous sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his eyes darted frantically around the grand foyer, completely ignoring the breathtaking floral arrangements and the elegant decor I had spent months planning. He did not look like a father arriving to see his eldest daughter on the eve of her wedding. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He marched straight past Julian without so much as a nod and stopped directly in front of me. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention our phone call from an hour ago. He offered absolutely no apology for abandoning his role in walking me down the aisle. Instead, he grabbed my arm and pulled me a few steps away from the seating chart, lowering his voice into a harsh, frantic whisper. Maya, listen to me very carefully, he demanded, his grip tight. We have a serious situation on our hands, and I need you to fix the seating arrangements right now. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. I took a step back, maintaining my professional posture. I am not rearranging the seating chart again, Dad. Chloe and Liam just tried that, and I shut it down. The board is finalized. Forget about your sister, he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. This is not about family drama. This is about my career. My entire livelihood is on the line. He glanced around the empty foyer nervously before leaning in closer. You know my firm is facing a massive corporate buyout. The acquiring company is gutting our executive board. They are bringing in their own people and slashing the regional vice presidents. I am on the chopping block, Maya. If I lose this job, I lose everything. My pension, the country club memberships, the lifestyle your mother and I have built. I cannot let that happen. I stared at him, my expression perfectly blank. So what does your corporate restructuring have to do with my wedding? Calvin wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Because I invited him, he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw fear and desperate pride. I invited the CEO of the acquiring firm to your wedding. I pulled every string I had. I begged a mutual connection on the country club board to personally hand-deliver the invitation to his executive office. I pitched this wedding as an exclusive high society networking event, and his assistant confirmed his attendance this morning. He's actually coming. Julian, who had been standing a few feet away, giving us space, slowly crossed his arms over his chest. I did not look at him, but I could feel the sudden electric shift in his energy. Calvin's eyes were wide, practically begging me to understand the magnitude of his actions. Do you have any idea who this man is, Maya? His name is Elias Sterling. He is a legend. He is a billionaire titan in black commercial real estate. The man is untouchable. He does not go to local events. He does not mingle with middle management. The fact that he accepted this invitation is a miracle. It is my only chance to get FaceTime with him outside of a boardroom. If I can impress him tonight and tomorrow, if I can show him that I operate in the same elite social circles he does, I can secure my position as VP. I can save my job. My father was breathing heavily now, pointing a rigid, shaking finger at the beautiful acrylic seating chart I had just defended from my sister. You need to take whoever you have sitting at table 1 and move them to the back, Calvin ordered. I do not care if it is Julian's family. I do not care if it is your best friends. You will put Elias Sterling at the absolute best table in this room. You will instruct the catering staff to give him priority service. You will make sure the bartender knows exactly what he drinks. Dad, I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. You invited a corporate CEO to my wedding without asking me, purely to stage a desperate networking opportunity to save your own job. And now you are demanding I demote my own guests to accommodate a stranger. Hi is not a stranger! Calvin hissed, his temper flaring as he lost his patience with my resistance. He is the man who holds my entire future in his hands. You need to understand your priorities, Maya. This man's presence is more important than your little ceremony. Do you hear me? This is not about your dress or your flowers. This is about real power. Do not embarrass me in front of Elias Sterling. If you ruin this for me by acting stubborn, I swear to you I will never forgive you. He turned his glare toward Julian. And you? Calvin added, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. Keep your distance from him tomorrow. The last thing I need is my new boss thinking I associate with broke nonprofit workers, begging for charity handouts. Just stay out of the way. The sheer audacity of his demands hung in the air, heavy and toxic. My father had just explicitly told me that impressing a wealthy CEO was vastly more important than celebrating his daughter's marriage. He was willing to trample over my wedding insult, my future husband, and rearrange my entire reception just to save his own inflated corporate ego. It was the ultimate betrayal, stripping away the very last illusion I had that my father possessed any genuine love for me. But beneath the sharp, piercing sting of his disrespect, a brilliant, beautiful wave of vindication washed over my soul. My father had absolutely no idea what he had just done. He was standing here sweating and shaking, lecturing me about the power of Elias Sterling. He was lecturing me about the massive corporate buyout threatening his job. I did not know that I was the senior director of acquisitions at Sterling Enterprises. He did not know that Elias Sterling had personally headhunted me 2 years ago to oversee the exact corporate buyout that was currently keeping my father awake at night. I was the executive leading the audit on my father's division. And even better, my father had absolutely no idea who he had just insulted. He looked at Julian and saw a nobody. He saw an inner-city charity worker with no money and no status. He did not know that Julian's full name was Julian Sterling. He did not know that the man he had just ordered to stay out of the way was Elias Sterling's only son, the sole heir to the multi-billion-dollar real estate empire my father was so desperate to impress. Julian used his mother's maiden name professionally to run his youth programs without the heavy, imposing shadow of his father's billions dictating his life. I looked at Julian. His face was a masterclass in composure. Not a single muscle twitched. He just gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set, and my father had just enthusiastically locked himself inside it. I turned my attention back to my father. I smoothed my expression into a mask of perfect, compliant serenity. I let out a soft sigh as if conceding defeat to his superior wisdom. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice smooth and agreeable. "I understand completely. A man of Elias Sterling's stature deserves the utmost respect. We absolutely cannot have him sitting just anywhere." Calvin let out a massive breath of relief, his shoulders dropping as the tension temporarily left his body. "Good. Thank you, Maya. I knew you would be reasonable about this. Just make sure the table is right up front by the sweetheart table. I need to be able to approach him naturally." "Consider it done," I replied, offering him a polite, chilling smile. "I will personally guarantee that Elias Sterling sits exactly where he belongs tomorrow. And I promise you, Dad, it will be a seating arrangement you will never ever forget." My father gave me a brisk nod, adjusted his tie, and turned around, marching back out the front doors with a renewed sense of arrogant purpose. He had gotten what he came for, or at least he thought he had. I stood in the foyer, staring at the closed doors. The sheer poetic justice of the universe was almost too perfect to believe. My family had spent years worshipping false wealth, chasing status, and tearing me down to elevate themselves. Tomorrow they were going to get a front row seat to real power, and it was going to cost them absolutely everything. The quiet in the grand foyer lasted for exactly 30 seconds. I had barely taken 2 steps back toward the ballroom to rejoin Julian when the heavy glass entrance doors swung violently open. The loud, sharp sound of leather dress shoes striking the marble floor echoed through the cavernous space. I stopped and turned around. It was my father. Calvin was a man who practically worshipped his own reflection. As a regional vice president at a mid-sized logistics firm, he treated every day of his life like an executive board meeting. He usually carried himself with a stiff, arrogant posture, wearing custom-tailored suits and a condescending smirk that let everyone know he felt superior to them. But the man marching toward me right now looked nothing like the polished executive I grew up with. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose around his collar. A visible sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, catching the light from the chandeliers above. His eyes darted frantically around the foyer, completely ignoring the breathtaking floral installations and the elegant decor I had spent months curating. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a scaffold waiting for the lever to be pulled. Julian stepped out of the ballroom right at that moment, instantly sensing the erratic shift in the room's energy. He moved to stand securely by my side, his presence a warm, calming anchor. My father marched straight past Julian as if he were entirely invisible. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was feeling on the eve of my wedding. He certainly did not offer a single word of apology for calling me an hour ago to coldly announce he was refusing to walk me down the aisle. Instead, he reached out and grabbed my forearm, his grip uncomfortably tight. "Maya, listen to me very carefully," he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, frantic whisper. "We have a serious situation on our hands, and I need you to fix the seating arrangements right now." I gently but firmly pried his fingers off my arm and took a deliberate step back, establishing my physical boundary. "I am not rearranging the seating chart again, Dad," I said, maintaining my professional composure. "Chloe and Liam just tried to commandeer the VIP tables 10 minutes ago, and I shut them down. The board is finalized." "Forget about your sister," he snapped, waving his hand in the air as if swatting away a fly. "This has absolutely nothing to do with her petty drama. This is about my career. My entire livelihood is on the line, and I am not going to let your stubbornness ruin it." I stared at him, my expression perfectly blank. "What does your corporate job have to do with my wedding reception?" Calvin wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You know, my firm is currently facing a massive corporate buyout. The acquiring company is completely ruthless. They are gutting our executive board. They are bringing in their own people and slashing the regional vice presidents. I am on the chopping block, Maya. If I lose this job, I lose everything. My pension, the country club memberships, the entire lifestyle your mother and I have spent decades building. I cannot let that happen. I remained silent, waiting for the connection. I knew all about his firm's buyout far more intimately than he could ever possibly comprehend, but I needed to hear exactly what he had done. Because I invited him, Calvin said, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of raw fear and desperate pride. I secretly invited the chief executive officer of the acquiring firm to your wedding. I pulled every single string I had. I begged a mutual connection on the country club board to personally hand-deliver the invitation directly to his executive office. I pitched this wedding as an exclusive high society networking event, and his assistant called me 20 minutes ago. He confirmed his attendance. He is actually coming. Julian slowly crossed his arms over his chest. I did not look at him, but I could feel the sudden electric shift in his energy. Calvin's eyes were wide, practically pleading with me to understand the magnitude of his actions. Do you have any idea who this man is, Maya? His name is Elias Sterling. He is an absolute legend. He is a billionaire titan in black commercial real estate. The man is virtually untouchable. He does not go to local events. He does not mingle with middle management. The fact that he accepted this invitation is a miracle. It is my only chance to get FaceTime with him outside of a hostile boardroom. If I can impress him tonight and tomorrow, if I can show him that I operate in the exact same elite social circles he does, I can secure my position as vice president. I can save my job. My father was breathing heavily now. He raised a rigid, shaking finger and pointed directly at the beautiful frosted acrylic seating chart I had just defended. You need to take whoever you have sitting at table 1 and move them to the back. Calvin ordered, his tone shifting from frantic to dictatorial. I do not care if it is Julian's family. I do not care if it is your best friends. You will put Elias Sterling at the absolute best table in this room. You will instruct the catering staff to give him priority service. You will make sure the bartender knows exactly what he drinks. You are going to treat him like royalty. I looked at the man who had raised me. Let me make sure I understand you correctly, I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. You invited a corporate CEO to my wedding without asking my permission, purely to stage a desperate networking opportunity to save your own job. You abandoned your role as my father, refusing to walk me down the aisle because you did not want to upset Chloe, but you are perfectly happy to use my wedding as a prop to save your own skin. And now you are demanding I demote my own guests to accommodate a stranger. Hai is not a stranger. Calvin hissed, his temper flaring dangerously as he lost his patience with my resistance. He is the man who holds my entire future in his hands. You need to understand your priorities, Maya. This man's presence is more important than your little ceremony. Do you hear me? This is not about your dress or your flowers. This is about real power. Do not embarrass me in front of Elias Sterling. If you ruin this for me by acting stubborn, I swear to you I will never forgive you. He then turned his glare toward Julian. The disdain in my father's eyes was palpable, a heavy, suffocating judgment that he had hurled at Julian since the day they met. And you, Calvin added, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. Keep your distance from him tomorrow. Do not approach his table. Do not try to strike up a conversation. The last thing I need is my new boss thinking I associate with broke nonprofit workers begging for charity handouts. Just stay completely out of the way. The sheer audacity of his demands hung in the air, heavy and toxic. My father had just explicitly stated that impressing a wealthy CEO was vastly more important than celebrating his daughter's marriage. He was willing to trample over my wedding, insult my future husband to his face, and rearrange my entire reception just to salvage his inflated corporate ego. He glared at me one last time, expecting my immediate compliance. Fix the board, Maya. Do it now, he commanded. Without waiting for my response, he turned sharply on his heel and marched toward the venue's private lounge, clearly needing a stiff drink to calm his frayed nerves. I stood perfectly still, watching him walk away. The betrayal was staggering, but it was quickly eclipsed by something far more powerful. A slow, brilliant wave of vindication washed over my soul. My father was terrified of Elias Sterling. He was terrified of the corporate buyout. He had just demanded that we bow down to the sterling name, and he had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. The transition from the sunlit foyer of our wedding venue to the dim amber glow of the rehearsal dinner felt like stepping onto a completely different battlefield. I had rented out the entire main dining room of a highly exclusive soul food fusion restaurant in downtown Atlanta. It was an upscale, sophisticated space featuring exposed brick walls, plush velvet booths, and low-hanging brass fixtures that cast a warm light over the long banquet tables. The menu boasted elevated Southern cuisine, featuring braised short ribs, lobster macaroni and cheese, and bourbon-glazed salmon. I had paid the exorbitant buyout fee 6 months in advance, wanting to treat both our families to an unforgettable evening of celebration. But as I sat at the head of the long table, the atmosphere felt incredibly toxic. Julian sat to my right, his posture relaxed and his energy remarkably grounded, while my family occupied the seats directly across from us. They were radiating a frantic, nervous energy entirely consumed by my father's earlier discovery that a billionaire corporate giant would be attending the reception tomorrow. My mother, Brenda, kept adjusting her designer wrap, her eyes darting around the room, evaluating the service and the decor as if searching for something to criticize. Chloe and Liam sat next to her, looking exceptionally smug, entirely convinced that they were the most important people in the room. Halfway through the main course, my father tapped his silver fork against his crystal wine glass. The clear, ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation, silencing the room immediately. Calvin stood up, buttoning his jacket with a practiced, arrogant motion. He puffed out his chest, projecting the commanding aura he usually reserved for mid-level corporate boardrooms. Traditionally, the father of the bride uses the rehearsal dinner toast to welcome the groom's family, share a fond childhood memory, and offer a heartfelt blessing for the couple's future. I watched my father raise his glass, knowing full well that tradition meant absolutely nothing to him if it did not serve his own ego. "I want to welcome everyone here tonight," Calvin began, his deep voice carrying across the quiet dining room. "Marriage is a monumental step. It is the foundation of legacy. It is about building wealth, securing your future, and aligning yourself with people who elevate your standing in the world." He did not look at me when he said this. He did not look at Julian. Instead, Calvin turned his body and directed his gaze entirely toward my sister and her husband. "When I think about a successful marriage, I do not have to look very far," Calvin continued, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his face for the first time that day. "I just look at Chloe and Liam." I took a slow sip of my water, my face completely impassive. He was actually doing it. He was hijacking the rehearsal dinner for my wedding to deliver a glowing performance review of my sister's marriage. "Liam," my father said, raising his glass higher in my brother-in-law's direction, "your family has been a pillar of the Northeastern financial community for generations. That kind of pedigree, that kind of old money sophistication, is exactly what this family respects. You came into our lives and showed us what a true partnership looks like. You provide for my youngest daughter beautifully. You understand the importance of legacy. Seeing the two of you navigate high society with such effortless grace makes a father incredibly proud. You are the gold standard." I watched Chloe preen under the praise. She fluffed her hair, sitting up straighter, absolutely basking in the validation. Liam leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest, completely ignoring the fact that his bank accounts were likely running on fumes. He soaked up my father's worship like a sponge, wearing that same scuffed, outdated luxury watch on his wrist. It was a masterful display of shared delusion. My father was praising the financial stability of a man who was quietly drowning in hidden debt while totally ignoring the daughter who had paid for the very food he was currently eating. Calvin spent a full 10 minutes waxing poetic about Chloe and Liam. He talked about their country club wedding as if it were a royal coronation. He praised their networking skills and their social circle. He essentially used my rehearsal dinner to reassure Liam that he was the favorite, most valued addition to our family. Then the mood in the room shifted. My father finally turned his attention to Julian. The bright, admiring smile vanished from Calvin's face, replaced by a patronizing, deeply sympathetic expression. "And then we have Julian," Calvin said, his tone dropping into a condescending register that made my blood run cold. Julian looked up at my father, his dark eyes perfectly calm. He did not tense. He did not frown. He just watched my father with the quiet, unshakable armor of a man who literally stood to inherit a multi-billion-dollar empire. Julian, you have a good heart. Calvin continued, shaking his head slightly, as if speaking to a misguided teenager. The work you do at that youth center, helping inner-city kids learn how to code, it is noble. It really is. We need idealistic people in the world. But let us be honest with each other tonight. Passion does not pay the mortgage. Charity work does not build a legacy. My mother. Brenda nodded emphatically from across the table, completely endorsing the public humiliation of my future husband. Julian's aunt and uncle, who were seated near the end of the table, exchanged a brief, amused glance. They were highly successful, brilliant people who knew exactly what Julian's net worth actually was, but they remained perfectly silent, honoring our decision to let my family dig their own graves. Maya is accustomed to a certain lifestyle, Calvin lectured, leaning forward and pointing his glass at Julian. She has worked incredibly hard in the corporate sector to get where she is. She is a director. She deals with serious acquisitions. She needs a husband who can match that drive, not a charity project she has to financially subsidize. You are stepping into a family that values ambition, Julian. You cannot expect my daughter to carry the financial burden of this marriage simply because you want to save the world on a nonprofit salary. The utter silence in the restaurant was deafening. The waitstaff had actually stopped moving, sensing the sheer, unadulterated disrespect radiating from the head table. I felt a surge of protective anger flare in my chest, but before I could speak, my father delivered his final devastating insult. "But do not worry," Calvin said, offering Julian a tight, pitying smile. "You are marrying a Williams now. I take care of my own. Once the wedding is over and the dust settles, I am going to make a few calls. I have a vast network in the corporate logistics sector. I can pull some strings, leverage my reputation, and get you an entry-level position at a real corporate firm. We will get you out of that youth center and into a suit. It is the absolute least I can do to help you become a real provider for my daughter." Calvin raised his glass one last time, looking around the room as if expecting a round of applause for his incredible generosity. "To Maya and Julian, may you eventually find your footing." I took a sip of his wine and sat back down, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Chloe leaned over and whispered something to Liam, and the two of them quietly snickered. Underneath the table, I squeezed Julian's thigh. My nails dug slightly into his dark trousers, a physical manifestation of the fury I was holding back. My father had just publicly humiliated the man I loved. He had insulted his character, mocked his dedication to his community, and arrogantly offered to hand him an entry-level job as an act of pity. I looked at Julian. I expected him to be angry. I expected him to finally defend himself. Instead, Julian picked up his water glass. He looked directly across the table at my father. His expression was a masterclass in emotional control. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, profound pity for the small-minded man sitting across from him. "I appreciate the advice," Calvin Julian said, his voice rich, steady, and echoing clearly across the silent dining room. "And I am very grateful for your generous offer to help me find a real job. I will absolutely keep that in mind when Monday morning rolls around." He took a slow sip of his water and set the glass down. He did not break eye contact with my father. I watched the subtle flex of Julian's jaw and knew exactly what he was thinking. My father had just mocked the sole heir to Sterling Enterprises. He had just offered an entry-level logistics job to a man whose family literally owned the corporate buildings my father worked in. I reached for my own wine glass, bringing the dark red liquid to my lips, to hide the cold, calculating smile that threatened to break across my face. Let them laugh, I thought, watching my parents and sister toast to their own perceived superiority. Let them enjoy this final evening of arrogance. Because tomorrow the illusion would end, and the reality of exactly who they were dealing with would burn their perfectly constructed world straight to the ground. The heavy atmosphere of the dining room pressed against my shoulders as Julian set his water glass down. My father looked immensely proud of his insulting toast, oblivious to the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I needed a moment to breathe, to steady the cold fury radiating through my veins before I did something premature. I excused myself from the table, offering Julian a reassuring touch on his shoulder, and made my way toward the restaurant restrooms. The restroom was a lavish space of gold-framed mirrors and dark marble counters. I turned on the brass faucet and let the cool water run over my wrists. I looked at my reflection. I was calm. I was ready. But before I could even reach for a hand towel, the heavy wooden door swung open behind me. My mother marched in. Brenda did not look like a woman enjoying her eldest daughter's rehearsal dinner. She looked like a general preparing to issue a battlefield command. She crossed her arms over her expensive wrap, her lips pressed into a tight, unhappy line. "Maya, we need to talk," Brenda stated, locking the restroom door behind her. I dried my hands slowly, never breaking eye contact with her reflection in the mirror. "We are at my rehearsal dinner, Mom. Can this wait until tomorrow?" "No, it cannot wait," she snapped. "It is about tomorrow. It is about Chloe." "Of course it is." I turned around to face her, leaning back against the cool marble counter. "What is the emergency now?" Brenda let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head, as if dealing with a completely unreasonable child. "Chloe is devastated, Maya. You saw her out there. Liam's parents arrived in Atlanta this afternoon, and they have already been making comments about how extravagant this whole weekend is. They are making Chloe feel like her own wedding was inadequate. Her confidence is completely shattered. She feels like she is fading into the background." I stared at my mother. Chloe had spent the entire evening loudly bragging about her country club membership and looking down her nose at Julian. Fading into the background was the absolute last thing my sister was doing. "I am not responsible for Chloe's insecurities," I said evenly. "I am getting married tomorrow. I am not going to apologize for hosting a beautiful event." "I am not asking you to apologize," Brenda replied, stepping closer. "I am telling you the solution we came up with. Chloe bought a new dress for the ceremony tomorrow. It is going to help her stand out and feel confident in front of the Pembertons. I brought a picture to show you so you are not surprised." My mother pulled her phone from her clutch, tapped the screen, and held it out to me. I looked at the image, expecting some overly sequined cocktail dress. What I saw made my breath catch in pure stunned disbelief. The dress on the screen was a floor-length white lace gown. It had a sweetheart neckline, a sweeping train, and delicate pearl embellishments scattered across the bodice. It was not a bridesmaid dress. It was not an evening gown. It was a bridal gown. My sister had gone out and purchased a literal wedding dress to wear to my wedding. "You cannot be serious," I said, my voice dropping to a flat, dangerous register. "She is not wearing a white wedding gown to my ceremony." "It is not white," Brenda argued, waving her hand dismissively. "It is ivory cream, and it is just a dress, Maya. Do not be so traditional and rigid. Chloe needs this. She needs Liam's family to see her looking like royalty. She needs to feel like she is on the same level as you tomorrow. If you force her to wear that simple blue slip dress you picked out for the guests, she will look like a peasant next to all your corporate friends." "She is wearing the blue dress, Mom, or she is not attending the wedding," I stated. "There is no negotiation here. You are not going to let my sister play dress up as a bride on the one day that is supposed to belong to me." Brenda's face hardened. The mask of maternal concern vanished entirely, replaced by the vicious, controlling matriarch I had known my whole life. She stepped right up to me, her eyes flashing with cruel intent. "You are going to let her wear the dress, Maya," Brenda commanded. "Because if you do not, your father and I will not be walking down that aisle anyway. But we will take it a step further. If you try to ban Chloe from wearing this gown, your father, your sister, Liam, and I will sit in the absolute back row of the ceremony. We will sit by the exit doors like unwanted strangers." She paused, letting the threat hang in the air to ensure I understood the full weight of her malice. "And when the ceremony is over," Brenda continued, her voice dripping with venom, "we will boycott the reception photos. All of them. We will not stand in a single family portrait. You will have no pictures with your parents or your sister. You will look like an orphan in your own wedding album. Your corporate friends and Julian's family will wonder why your own blood relatives refuse to stand next to you. It will be the ultimate humiliation." Now, what is it going to be, the dress or your family? For 35 years, my mother had used public humiliation and emotional blackmail to keep me in line. She expected me to panic. She expected me to cry, to beg, to cave in to her demands, just to preserve the illusion of a happy family for the wedding photographer. I looked at my mother. I looked at the absolute conviction in her eyes that she held all the power. And then I felt a deep, profound sense of liberation. She had just handed me the greatest gift she could ever possibly give me. She had just given me a legitimate, undeniable reason to erase them from my life completely. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of all emotion. Brenda smiled, a triumphant, smug expression spreading across her face. "I knew you would see reason, Maya. It is just a dress." "No," I interrupted, holding my phone up between us. "You are right about the seating." I unlocked my screen and opened my text messages. I navigated to the contact for my head of private event security. I typed a message while looking directly into my mother's eyes. "Change of plans for tomorrow," I said aloud, narrating my text message as I typed it. "My parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law have explicitly requested to be seated in the absolute back row of the venue. Row Z, general admission. Under no circumstances are they to be allowed into the VIP seating area. If they attempt to move to the front, escort them out." I hit send. Brenda's triumphant smile faltered. Her eyes widened in confusion. "What are you doing?" I opened my next contact. It was the lead photographer I had hired for a premium $10,000 package. "I have another update." I continued, my voice steady and cold. "The bride's biological family has opted out of all wedding photography. Please strike Calvin, Brenda, Chloe, and Liam from the master shot list. Cancel the family portrait session before the reception. If they attempt to jump into any group photos, kindly ask them to step aside. I only want pictures with people who actually want to be there." I hit send again. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked at Brenda. The blood had completely drained from her face. She was staring at me as if I had just transformed into a monster. "You wanted the back row, Mom," I said, stepping away from the counter and walking toward the restroom door. "The back row is yours. You wanted to boycott the photos to embarrass me. Consider yourself permanently erased from the visual history of my life." "Maya, you cannot do this," Brenda stammered, panic finally cracking her voice. "You cannot put us in the back row. What will Liam's parents think? What will your father's CEO think if he sees us sitting in the back like strangers?" "They will think exactly what you told them to think," I replied, placing my hand on the brass door handle, "that you are strangers. You agreed to your terms. Make sure Chloe wears the blue dress tomorrow. If she shows up in white, security will not even let her through the front gates." I unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Have a wonderful evening, Mom. I will see you in row Z tomorrow." I walked out of the restroom, leaving my mother standing alone in front of the marble mirrors, entirely paralyzed by the realization that her ultimate threat had just been used to permanently destroy her own social standing. I glided back into the dining room. Julian looked up as I approached the table. He saw the sharp, unyielding clarity in my eyes. I sat down next to him and placed my hand over his. "Everything okay?" Julian asked quietly. "Everything is perfectly on track," I whispered back. The dinner concluded an hour later. My family remained unusually quiet, casting nervous, bewildered glances in my direction. They knew the dynamic had shifted, but they still did not grasp the full magnitude of the avalanche heading their way. As the guests began to file out of the restaurant and into the warm Atlanta night, I checked my phone. I had one new message from an unsaved number. The text was brief and direct. "Lounge at the Four Seasons, midnight. Bring a secure bag." It was Elias Sterling, my father's idol, Julian's father, my boss. I showed the text to Julian. He gave a sharp nod. The final pieces were moving into place. My family had spent the entire day digging a massive, inescapable pit. Now Elias and I were going to bury them in it. I kissed Julian goodnight, hailed a private car, and headed toward the hotel. The time for playing the dutiful, disrespected daughter was officially over. It was time to go to work. The ride to the Four Seasons took less than 15 minutes, but my mind was moving at light speed. The streets of downtown Atlanta flashed past my window in a blur of neon and streetlights. I stepped out of the private car and handed the driver a generous tip before walking through the revolving glass doors of the hotel. The midnight lobby was hushed and steeped in the scent of expensive cedar and polished leather. I bypassed the main reception desk and headed straight for the private executive lounge tucked away on the mezzanine level. Elias Sterling was sitting in a high-backed leather booth in the darkest corner of the room. Even at midnight, the man commanded the space without trying. He wore a tailored charcoal suit without a tie, exuding the quiet, lethal authority that had made him a titan in black commercial real estate. A glass of neat bourbon sat untouched on the table in front of him. Beside it rested two thick manila folders. I slid into the booth across from him and set my leather tote bag on the seat. "Good evening, Elias," I said, keeping my voice low and respectful. Elias did not offer a polite greeting. His dark eyes, the exact same shade as Julian's, locked onto mine with a fierce, protective anger that caught me slightly off guard. "I heard about the toast your father gave tonight," Elias said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated across the table. "Julian sent me a message right after the dinner concluded. He told me Calvin stood up in front of a room full of people and offered my son an entry-level logistics job out of pity. He told me your father spent 10 minutes praising that useless trust fund brat your sister married while mocking the man you chose to build a life with." I nodded slowly. "He did exactly that. My father believes Julian is a broke charity worker. He thinks he is doing me a favor by trying to pull Julian into corporate servitude." Elias let out a sharp, humorless laugh that held absolutely no warmth. "Your father is a fool, Maya. He is a small, insecure man who worships the illusion of wealth because he has absolutely no concept of how real power actually moves. He has spent the last 3 weeks harassing my executive assistants, begging for a 5-minute meeting with me so he can beg for his job. And then he has the audacity to disrespect my future daughter-in-law and my only son at their own rehearsal dinner." Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany table. He slid the first thick manila folder across the surface until it stopped right in front of me. "Open it," he commanded softly. I unclasped the string and opened the folder. The documents inside were the finalized, legally binding acquisition papers for my father's corporate logistics firm. I had spent the last 8 months running the aggressive financial audit on his specific division, meticulously documenting the toxic management practices, the inflated expense reports, and the complete lack of operational integrity my father oversaw. The board of directors officially signed off on the buyout at 6 o'clock this evening, Elias explained, watching my eyes scan the legal signatures. "We own them, Maya. The ink is dry. And more importantly, I reviewed your final executive recommendation regarding the regional vice presidents." I looked up at him. "I recommended that Calvin's entire tier of management be eliminated due to systemic financial inefficiency. I also explicitly noted that his termination should be processed without a severance package given the documented ethical violations in his quarterly reporting." Elias gave a slow, approving nod. "And I approved your recommendation without a single revision. Your father is officially unemployed as of Monday morning. His pension is frozen pending a secondary internal review, and his corporate expense accounts have already been deactivated. He just does not know it yet. He is going to walk into your wedding tomorrow thinking he is a big-shot executive who is going to network his way into my good graces. I want you to be the one to hand him his termination papers." I traced my finger over the edge of the folder, a profound sense of justice settling deep into my bones. My father had demanded I move my guests to the back of the room to accommodate a billionaire. Tomorrow I was going to use that exact placement to hand him his professional death warrant. "I will gladly deliver the news," I said, slipping the thick folder into my secure bag. Elias leaned back in his booth and tapped his fingers against the second manila folder. "But we are not finished, Maya. Julian also mentioned that your sister and her husband have been making your life incredibly difficult today. He said Liam has been making classist remarks about Julian's finances." "Liam is obsessed with his own pedigree," I replied smoothly. "He constantly throws his family's old money status in our faces. My parents treat him like absolute royalty because he happens to be white and comes from a historically wealthy New England banking family. They think he is the ultimate prize." Elias let out another dark chuckle and pushed the second folder across the table. "I hate to break it to your parents," Elias said, his tone dripping with lethal irony, "but their ultimate prize is effectively bankrupt." I froze, staring at the folder before quickly opening it. Inside was a comprehensive, highly classified financial portfolio outlining the assets and liabilities of the Pemberton Family Trust. My firm recently acquired a boutique asset management company based in Boston, Elias explained, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. During the due diligence process, we audited their largest accounts. The Pemberton Trust was one of them. Liam's father made a series of catastrophic real estate investments over the last decade. He leveraged the family's historical assets against toxic commercial properties that completely tanked. The trust is currently underwater by roughly $14 million. I stared at the spreadsheets, my mind rapidly processing the numbers. Liam has no money. Liam has negative money, Elias corrected sharply. He is living entirely on revolving credit and the rapidly decaying illusion of his family's name. The trust cannot even generate enough liquid cash to cover the maintenance taxes on their properties. We are actually moving to seize their primary estate next month to cover the outstanding debts they owe to the management firm we just bought. Your sister did not marry into wealth, Maya. She married a sinking ship. I looked at the documents detailing Liam's crippling debt. Chloe had spent the entire day parroting around my venue, acting like she was superior to everyone in the room. My parents had spent my entire rehearsal dinner praising Liam's financial stability and mocking Julian's nonprofit salary. They had humiliated me and Julian to elevate a man who was literally weeks away from having his family home seized by the very company I worked for. I closed the folder and looked up at Elias. The magnitude of the ammunition he had just handed me was staggering. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked quietly. "You could have your legal team handle this on Monday. You did not have to bring this to me at midnight on the eve of my wedding." Elias softened his expression, the ruthless corporate titan melting away to reveal the fiercely protective father underneath. "Because you are family." Maya, Elias said, his voice resonant and deeply sincere. "Julian loves you more than anything in this world, and you have proven yourself to be a brilliant, formidable woman. You have operated with nothing but integrity and grace, while your own blood relatives have treated you with unforgivable disrespect. I do not tolerate disrespect toward my family. Period. Your parents think they can bully you because they think you are standing alone. Tomorrow we are going to show them exactly who stands behind you." I felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in my throat. For 35 years I had craved that exact kind of unconditional protection from my own father. I had worked myself to the bone trying to earn a fraction of the respect Elias Sterling was giving me freely right now. My biological father had abandoned me at the altar to chase a corporate promotion. My future father-in-law was handing me the sword to slay my dragons because he believed in my character and my competence. I slipped the second folder into my bag and zipped it shut securely. "Thank you, Elias," I said, looking him directly in the eyes, "for everything." He smiled, a genuine warm expression that mirrored Julian's perfectly. "Get some sleep, Maya. You have a very big day tomorrow, and when those doors open, keep your head high. Let them see the queen you are." I stood up from the booth, the weight of the secure bag grounding me. The anxiety, the hurt, and the residual anger from the rehearsal dinner had completely vanished. I walked out of the Four Seasons and stepped back into the warm night air of the city. I had everything I needed. My family had demanded a spectacle. They had demanded that I bow to their toxic hierarchy. Tomorrow they were going to get exactly what they asked for, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their spectacular collapse. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's master bridal suite, casting a warm golden glow over the spacious room. I sat in a plush velvet chair while my makeup artist applied the final touches of setting powder. The air smelled of fresh lavender, expensive champagne, and light hairspray. My three bridesmaids women, who had been my fiercely loyal friends since our undergraduate days at Spelman College, were lounging on the vintage velvet sofas across the room. Tasha, Keisha, and Jasmine were laughing softly, sipping mimosas, and radiating the kind of effortless, supportive energy that always made me feel grounded and secure. It was a picture of absolute serenity. I had slept better than I had in months. The heavy secure containing the Sterling Enterprises buyout documents and the Pemberton Trust financial ruin was locked safely inside the venue's master safe, waiting for the reception. I had all the power. I just needed to let the morning play out exactly as I anticipated. The calm was abruptly shattered when the suite door swung open without a single knock. The laughter from the sofas died instantly. My bridesmaids sat up straight, their expressions shifting from joyful relaxation to fierce protective alert. I opened my eyes and looked at the reflection in the vanity mirror. My mother Brenda marched into the room, first radiating a smug, victorious energy that practically choked the air. She stepped aside with a dramatic flourish, allowing my sister to enter behind her. And Chloe was wearing it. It was not just a white dress. It was an ivory cream floor-length lace gown featuring a sweetheart neckline, a sweeping train, and a sheer back. It was decorated with intricate pearl embellishments that caught the morning light shimmering with every step she took. She had even pinned her hair up into an elegant chignon with crystal hairpieces. She had practically walked out of a bridal boutique catalog. She had intentionally chosen a dress that screamed bride, stepping into my wedding suite with the sole purpose of stealing my moment and demanding attention. Brenda stood right beside her, arms crossed tightly over her chest, a defiant smirk plastered across her face. They stood there in the center of the suite waiting. They were waiting for me to gasp. They were waiting for me to leap out of the makeup chair, burst into tears, and throw the screaming, hysterical tantrum they had been banking on since the rehearsal dinner last night. They wanted me to beg them to change. They desperately needed me to care, to show them that they still held emotional power over my life. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply met my mother's expectant gaze in the mirror and tapped my makeup artist's wrist, gently signaling her to continue blending my contour. My complete lack of reaction seemed to visibly confuse my mother, causing her smug smile to falter at the edges. "Well," Maya Brenda announced, her voice loud and grating against the quiet luxury of the suite. "We told you last night that Chloe needed to feel confident today. I think we can all agree this gown is absolutely stunning. It fits her perfectly." Chloe shifted her weight, running her hands down the lace bodice of the gown, striking a pose like a runway model. "Liam absolutely loves it," Chloe added, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive sweetness. "His mother actually complimented the beadwork when we saw them at breakfast this morning. I just wanted to make sure I looked appropriate for the caliber of guests we are hosting today. I know you said I should wear the blue slip dress, but this just feels so much more me." It was pathetic. She was a 32-year-old married woman playing dress-up in a desperate bid to outshine her own sister entirely because our mother told her she had to. My bridesmaids were practically vibrating with rage. Tasha stood up from the sofa, her hands balled into tight fists, ready to physically throw my sister out of the room. I caught Tasha's eye in the mirror and gave her a sharp, subtle look. "Stand down. I had this completely under control." "It is definitely a choice, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly level, smooth, and devoid of any emotional weight. "It is a very bold, very deliberate choice. I am glad Liam and his parents approve." Brenda frowned, stepping further into the room. This was not the reaction she had orchestrated. "So you are not going to throw a fit?" Brenda asked, unable to hide the bitter disappointment in her voice. "You are just going to accept that your sister is wearing this to the ceremony?" "Mom, I am 35 years old," I replied finally, turning in my chair to face them directly. "I manage commercial real estate acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you honestly believe I have the time or the emotional capacity to throw a tantrum over a piece of lace? If Chloe feels that she needs to wear a bridal gown to my wedding to secure her own self-esteem, then she is absolutely free to wear it." Chloe looked deeply unsettled by my complete apathy. She had weaponized this dress, expecting it to be a devastating blow to my ego. Instead, it was bouncing right off my armor. She looked down at the pearls on her bodice, suddenly seeming self-conscious. She was slowly realizing that wearing a wedding dress to someone else's wedding did not make her look superior. It just made her look incredibly, hopelessly desperate. Brenda, realizing she was losing the psychological upper hand, narrowed her eyes into dangerous slits. "Just remember our agreement, Maya. Your father, your sister, Liam, and I are sitting in the back row. We are not participating in any of the family portraits. You made your choice last night, and we are sticking to our consequences. We will not be celebrating with you today." "I have not forgotten our agreement, Mom," I said, offering her a chillingly polite smile. "In fact, I have made absolutely certain that your seating arrangements will be enforced exactly as we discussed." I turned back to the mirror, examining my flawless makeup. "Now, if you will excuse me, my photographer is arriving in 5 minutes for my private bridal portraits. And since you have explicitly opted out of the photography schedule, you are currently trespassing in my suite." Brenda stared at me. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She expected a fight. She expected me to scream and cry so she could call me unstable. Instead, I was perfectly calm. I did not raise my voice. I looked past my mother to the heavy wooden door of the suite. I had texted my head of security 10 minutes ago. Terrence was a retired police officer who now ran a private protection firm for high-profile corporate events. He stood right outside the door with two of his best guards. I gave him a single sharp nod. Terrence stepped into the room. He wore a crisp, dark suit and a discreet earpiece. His presence immediately changed the gravity of the room. He was 6 feet 3 inches of pure, unbothered authority. Ladies, Terrence said, his voice a low rumble that left absolutely no room for negotiation. It is time to clear the suite. Please gather your belongings and step into the hallway. Brenda spun around. She looked at the security team and then back at me. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. What is the meaning of this? I am the mother of the bride. You cannot throw me out of my own daughter's suite. You threw yourself out, Mom, I said smoothly, turning back to my vanity mirror. You gave me an ultimatum. You said if I did not let Chloe wear a wedding dress, you would sit in the back row and boycott all the family portraits. I accepted your terms. My photographer is waiting in the hall to take my private portraits. Since you are not participating, you have no business being in the bridal suite. Chloe grabbed our mother's arm. Her fake confidence was evaporating rapidly. Mom, tell them to leave. We are supposed to drink champagne and take getting ready pictures. Liam is waiting for us to send him photos. There are no pictures, Chloe, I replied, checking my lipstick in the mirror. You are general admission guests now. General admission guests do not get private suite access. Terrence took a step forward. He did not touch them, but his physical proximity was enough to make Brenda take a step back. Ma'am, we need to exit the suite now, Terrence said politely but firmly. I can escort you to the main lobby where the general seating area will open in 45 minutes. 45 minutes! Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching up in genuine horror. You expect us to sit in the lobby for 45 minutes in this dress? The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. Chloe had planned to hide in the VIP suite until the very last second. She wanted to make a grand, dramatic entrance right before the ceremony started to ensure everyone saw her in her white lace gown. But if security forced her down to the lobby now, she would just be standing around with the caterers and the early arrivals. She would look completely ridiculous standing in a hotel lobby wearing a wedding dress, while the venue staff vacuumed the rugs and arranged the chairs. She would be a walking joke. Brenda tried to stand her ground. Maya, this is a mistake. If you do this, you are going to ruin the entire dynamic of the day. What are people going to think when they see us sitting in the back? What will Liam's parents think? What will your father's CEO think if he sees us sitting in the back like strangers? He will think you arrived late and could not find a better seat, I said, picking up my bridal bouquet. It was a beautiful arrangement of white roses and peonies. Julian and I have a wonderful day planned. I am not going to let your desperate need for control ruin a single second of it. Terrence, please escort these guests to row Z. Terrence gestured toward the door. Right this way, ladies. Brenda opened her mouth to scream. I could see the decades of toxic entitlement bubbling up in her throat. But she looked at the two security guards standing by the door. She looked at my 3 bridesmaids who were watching her with cold, unforgiving eyes. And finally, she looked at me. She saw a woman who was completely immune to her manipulation. The panic in my mother's eyes was absolute. She realized in that exact moment that she had overplayed her hand. She had stripped away her own familial privileges, and there was absolutely no way to get them back. Chloe burst into tears. Real tears this time, not the fake manipulative ones she used to get her way. She grabbed the heavy skirt of her white lace gown and practically ran out of the room, crying about how her hair was going to get ruined waiting in the humid lobby. Brenda gave me one last look of pure hatred before turning on her heel and following her golden child out the door. Terrence pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind them, and the lock clicked into place. The suite was quiet again. Tasha let out a long, slow breath and took a sip of her mimosa. Well, Tasha said, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. That was the most satisfying thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Keisha and Jasmine burst out laughing, the tension leaving the room entirely. I smiled and looked at my reflection one last time. I felt incredibly light. The toxic weight I had been carrying for 35 years was gone. I was not the invisible daughter anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and nobody was going to tear down what I had built. My photographer walked into the suite a few minutes later, followed by the videography team. They captured every beautiful moment of the morning. We took stunning portraits on the balcony, laughing and celebrating the beginning of my new chapter. There was no family drama to manage. There were no snide comments about my dress or my hair. There was just pure, unadulterated joy, surrounded by my sisters from Spelman College, who had always loved me unconditionally. As we wrapped up the photo session, Terrence knocked on the door and stepped inside. He gave me a brief professional nod. "The guests are seated," Maya Terrence reported. "Your parents and your sister are in the very last row, just as you requested." They caused a bit of a scene when the ushers refused to let them into the VIP section, but they eventually sat down. "The groom is at the altar, and your escort is waiting for you in the vestibule." "Thank you, Terrence," I said, handing my bouquet to Tasha. "It is time." I walked out of the bridal suite and down the long carpeted hallway toward the main sanctuary. My heart was beating in a steady, powerful rhythm. I could hear the string quartet playing a soft, beautiful melody from inside the ceremony hall. The music echoed through the corridor, building the anticipation. I turned the corner and stepped into the grand vestibule just outside the sanctuary doors. Elias Sterling was standing there waiting for me. He looked magnificent. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that radiated power and elegance. When he saw me walking toward him, a warm, genuine smile broke across his face. He stepped forward and gently took my hands in his. "You look absolutely breathtaking, Maya," Elias said, his deep voice filled with fatherly pride. "Julian is a very lucky man." I smiled, fighting back a sudden wave of happy tears. "I am the lucky one, Elias. Thank you for doing this. I know you did not plan to be front and center today." Elias gently tucked my arm through his, offering me his strong, steady support. "I would not want to be anywhere else," he said softly. "Your biological family made a catastrophic mistake today. But you are a Sterling now, Maya. We protect our own, and we always make an entrance." I took a deep breath, feeling completely anchored by his presence. Through the heavy oak doors, I could hear the music shift. The guests were standing up. My father, Calvin, was sitting in the very back row, completely unaware that the man he had spent weeks begging for a meeting with was standing right on the other side of the wood. My father thought he had punished me. He thought he had left me to walk alone and humiliated. "Are you ready?" Elias asked, patting my hand gently. I looked at the heavy doors, the final barrier between my past and my future. I thought about the empire I had built, the love I had found with Julian, and the absolute justice that was about to unfold. "I have never been more ready in my entire life," I replied. Elias nodded to the event coordinator. She smiled and pushed the heavy oak doors open wide. The bright light of the sanctuary poured into the vestibule, illuminating the path ahead. The string quartet swelled, playing the grand, majestic processional music. I lifted my chin, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward into the light. As the heavy oak doors began their slow sweep outward, time seemed to stretch into a long, suspended breath. The brilliant light of the sanctuary spilled into the vestibule, but before I took my first actual step down the white-carpeted aisle, my eyes instantly found the very back of the room. The venue was designed with a slight elevation toward the rear, giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of Row Z. There they were, my biological family. They were sitting exactly where I had exiled them, huddled together in the furthest, darkest corner of the magnificent space. I could see their posture clearly, even from 100 feet away. They were practically vibrating with toxic anticipation. Brenda had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face set in a mask of supreme arrogance. She was whispering something out of the corner of her mouth to Chloe, likely reassuring her favorite daughter that my impending public humiliation would make up for their current seating assignment. Chloe was slouched in her seat, doing her absolute best to make sure the top half of her inappropriate white lace bridal gown was visible to anyone who happened to glance back. She looked miserable and vindictive, trapped in the general admission section, with guests she deemed entirely beneath her. Beside her sat Liam. He was leaning back with that familiar, unearned confidence, his legs crossed at the ankle. I could easily imagine the stream of classist, bitter complaints he was currently whispering to my sister. He was undoubtedly complaining about being seated so far from the premium open bar, completely unaware that the trust fund he constantly bragged about was already dead in the water. But it was my father who painted the most pathetic picture. Calvin was not looking at the bridal entrance. He was not looking at the altar. His neck was craned entirely in the wrong direction. He was frantically scanning the front rows, his eyes darting across the VIP tables near the front of the room. He was desperately searching for Elias Sterling. My father had spent the entire morning ironing his luxury suit and rehearsing his corporate elevator pitch. I was sitting in the back row, fully believing that the billionaire CEO he needed to impress was already seated somewhere up front. Calvin thought that as soon as the ceremony concluded, he would smoothly navigate his way through the crowd, shake hands with Elias, and secure his regional vice president position. He had absolutely no idea that the man holding my arm was the very titan he was searching for. They were all waiting for my ultimate humiliation. My parents had played their final cruelest card, banking on the fact that a bride walking down the aisle completely alone would be a public display of brokenness. They expected the music to start and the doors to open on a sad, abandoned woman. They wanted the hundreds of guests to turn around and whisper about the bride who had no family to support her. They wanted Julian to stand at the altar and realize he was marrying into a family that completely rejected his bride. They thought their absence at my side was a weapon that would shatter my confidence and bring me crawling back to them, begging for their conditional love and approval. They had spent 35 years conditioning me to believe that I was nothing without their validation. They honestly believed that taking away my father's arm would ruin the most important day of my life. I looked away from row Z and shifted my gaze to the front of the room. The contrast was staggering. The front rows were filled with the most powerful, influential figures in commercial real estate. These were my colleagues, my mentors, and the executive board members of Sterling Enterprises. They were men and women who managed global portfolios and orchestrated billion-dollar acquisitions. They knew exactly who I was. They respected my mind, my work ethic, and my leadership. They did not care about the petty suburban country club politics my parents worshipped, and standing right at the end of the long white aisle was Julian. He stood beneath a towering arch of white orchids and trailing greenery. He looked incredibly handsome in a classic black tuxedo, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the open doorway. Julian did not look nervous. He did not look like a struggling charity worker out of his depth. He looked like a king standing in his own castle. He knew every single secret I was holding. He knew the financial ruin waiting for Liam. He knew the termination papers waiting for my father. And he knew that the man standing beside me was not just my boss, but his own father. The string quartet hit a powerful, resonant chord, transitioning from the soft prelude into the grand, sweeping notes of the bridal march. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, filling the massive sanctuary with a sense of undeniable majesty. A wave of movement swept through the room as 300 guests collectively rose to their feet. The rustle of expensive fabric and the soft murmur of awe rippled through the crowd. Every single person in the room turned their bodies towards the back, looking toward the open doors. I felt Elias shift slightly beside me. He tightened his arm, offering a firm, reassuring squeeze against my hand. I glanced up at him. His expression was a perfect portrait of fierce, protective authority. He was not just acting as a stand-in for an absent father. He was making a deliberate public statement to every corporate executive, every society elite, and every single member of my toxic family. I was declaring to the room that I belonged to the Sterling family now, and that I carried the full weight of their empire behind me. This was the silence before the storm. It was that breathtaking suspended microsecond just before the reality of the situation crashes into the minds of everyone watching. I took one final grounding breath, pulling the scent of the fresh floral arrangements deep into my lungs. I let go of every lingering ounce of childhood rejection. I let go of the mother who used me as a punching bag for her own insecurities. I let go of the sister who constantly tried to tear me down to make herself feel taller. I let go of the father who viewed my existence as nothing more than a corporate networking tool. They were sitting in the dark waiting for my downfall. They were about to witness my absolute triumph. The music swelled to its highest, most triumphant peak. I looked straight ahead, locking my eyes with Julian's, and took my first deliberate step onto the pristine white carpet of the aisle. As I stepped onto the thick white runner, the heavy oak doors closing silently behind us, the reality of the room came into sharp focus. We were at the very back of the sanctuary, right where row Z began. This was the exact spot my parents had chosen for their petty protest. My father was standing at the edge of the aisle, practically leaning into the walkway. He had positioned himself perfectly to witness what he thought would be my ultimate public humiliation. He had a tight, condescending smile plastered across his face, fully prepared to watch his abandoned daughter walk alone in front of hundreds of people. Then his eyes shifted from me to the man holding my arm. I watched the exact second my father's brain tried to process the impossible. Calvin had spent the last 3 weeks obsessively staring at corporate headshots of Elias Sterling. He had memorized the man's features, his biography, and his aggressive business acquisitions, desperate to force a networking opportunity that would save his failing career. Now that same billionaire titan was standing barely 2 feet away from him, gripping his daughter's arm with steadfast protective authority. The smug smile slid off my father's face, as if it had been physically carved away. All the color drained from his cheeks in an instant, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He let out a strangled, pathetic wheezing sound. His knees literally buckled under the crushing weight of his realization. He stumbled backward, his shoulder slamming hard against the wooden pew to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. He raised a trembling hand, perhaps a desperate, instinctive attempt to introduce himself or beg for mercy, but Elias did not even slow his pace. Elias turned his head and gave my father a single freezing look of absolute disgust. It was the look a king gives to a cockroach. My mother and sister did not know who Elias was. They only saw a distinguished, incredibly powerful black man, radiating generational wealth and authority, giving me away. But they saw my father's visceral reaction. Brenda reached out and grabbed Calvin's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into his suit jacket. She asked him what was wrong in a panicked, hissing whisper. Calvin could not answer her. He just stood there hyperventilating, staring in sheer terror at the back of Elias's tailored tuxedo as we walked past them. Chloe shrank back into her seat, her ridiculous white lace bridal gown suddenly looking cheap and foolish next to the overwhelming, effortless elegance that Elias commanded. We continued our walk down the long, flower-lined aisle. The music from the string quartet wrapped around us, triumphant and clear, perfectly matching the powerful rhythm of our footsteps. As we moved toward the center of the room, the dynamic shifted dramatically, from the panicked, suffocating silence of the back row to the awestruck murmurs of the front rows. My side of the aisle was filled with the top executives, board members, and legal teams from Sterling Enterprises. These were industry sharks who rarely showed emotion. Professionals who spent their lives managing global portfolios and orchestrating hostile takeovers. But as Elias Sterling walked past their pews, the polished corporate facade broke. I heard the sharp collective intake of breath from my colleagues. I heard the whispered gasps rippling through the crowd like electricity. The realization was connecting in real time. My colleagues, people who knew me as a fierce, uncompromising negotiator, were watching the notoriously private, untouchable chief executive officer of their empire walking his senior director down the aisle. The level of respect in the room magnified tenfold in a matter of seconds. Men and women who controlled billions in commercial assets bowed their heads slightly as we passed, an undeniable show of reverence for Elias and by direct extension for me. Liam was sitting at the back with my family, but the murmurs traveling backward through the venue were impossible to ignore. I could easily imagine the exact moment the whispers of the Sterling name reached his ears. The name of the massive corporation that was actively foreclosing on his family's trust fund. The utter devastation of realizing that his arrogant display of old money superiority meant absolutely nothing in the face of the empire I was marrying into. I was a man drowning in hidden debt, and he had just spent the entire weekend insulting the son of the man who owned his financial future. We reached the end of the aisle. The altar was framed by a towering installation of white orchids and trailing greenery, bathed in the warm light of the sanctuary. Julian was waiting for me there. His dark eyes were shining with profound love and a quiet, unshakable pride. He did not look like the struggling charity worker my family had mocked. He looked like a king standing in his own castle surrounded by his own loyal subjects. Elias stopped and turned to face me. He did not perform a traditional outdated handoff where a father gives his daughter away like property. Instead, he took both of my hands in his, leaning in to press a warm, gentle kiss to my cheek. "Welcome to the family," Maya Elias said, his deep, resonant voice carrying easily over the soft music of the quartet. "You have always been one of us, but today makes it official. I could not be prouder to stand by your side." I smiled, a genuine wave of emotion tightening my throat. "Thank you," I whispered back, my voice thick with gratitude. Elias turned to Julian, placing a firm, loving hand on his son's shoulder. They shared a look of mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond they shared. Then Elias stepped down into the very first row, taking his place at the absolute front of the venue. It was the seat of honor. The exact seat my father had desperately demanded for his corporate networking scheme, now occupied by the man who had stepped up to be the father I actually deserved. I stepped up to the altar and took Julian's hands. His grip was warm and solid, anchoring me completely in the present moment. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking beautiful words about partnership, trust, and building a foundation meant to last a lifetime. My heart was soaring. I had walked through the fire of my family's betrayal, through decades of conditional love and toxic expectations, and I had emerged completely unscathed. The storm had broken, washing away all the manipulation and the petty country club politics my parents worshipped. I was standing in the light, surrounded by a chosen family of immense power, loyalty, and absolute integrity. As Julian smiled, his thumb gently tracing the back of my hand, I felt a profound sense of peace. I knew the reception was going to be the final devastating act of this play. I knew the reckoning waiting for my father, my sister, and her husband would be absolute and unforgiving. But for this beautiful, perfect moment under the floral archway, I simply allowed myself to be a bride, deeply loved and fiercely protected. The applause from the front rows began as a polite, localized ripple, but as Elias and I reached the altar, it surged into a wave of genuine standing ovation. The contrast was staggering. Behind us in the very last row, my family sat in horrified silence, utterly paralyzed by their own miscalculations. In front of us, the most powerful people in Atlanta's commercial real estate sector were on their feet, honoring the union of their top executive and the heir to their empire. I turned to Julian. He reached out and took both of my hands, his touch warm and infinitely grounding. The ceremony that followed was beautiful, a sharp, necessary departure from the petty squabbles that had plagued the morning. But even as we exchanged vows and the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I knew the true reckoning was still waiting for us at the reception. The main ballroom had been transformed into an elegant moonlit garden. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, and a massive string orchestra played soft, sweeping arrangements from the elevated balcony. Julian and I made our grand entrance to rapturous applause, taking our seats at the sweetheart table positioned directly in the center of the room. To my immediate left at table 1 sat Elias Sterling and his closest executive board members. It was the exact table my father had demanded I surrender to him. To the far back right, separated by the dance floor, and dozens of other tables, sat my biological family. They looked completely out of place. Chloe kept adjusting her ridiculous white lace gown, finally realizing that nobody was looking at her. She wasn't the center of attention. She was just a woman wearing the wrong outfit in the wrong section. Brenda sat rigidly sipping her champagne with tight, unhappy lips, while Liam checked his outdated Rolex every 5 minutes, likely calculating how quickly he could secure an introduction with Elias. And then there was Calvin. My father hadn't touched his meal. He was sweating visibly, his eyes darting constantly toward table 1. He was waiting for his moment to strike. He truly believed that if he could just get 5 minutes with Elias, he could somehow charm his way out of the impending corporate buyout that threatened his job. I didn't have to wait long. As the main course was cleared, the orchestral music faded. The room fell into a comfortable, expectant hush as the microphone was brought to the center of the dance floor. It was time for the toasts. Usually the father of the bride speaks first, but Calvin had forfeited that right when he abandoned me. Instead, Elias Sterling stood up. I didn't just stand, he commanded the room. Elias walked slowly to the microphone, adjusting his suit jacket with a practiced, effortless elegance. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. Even from 50 feet away, I saw my father lean forward, practically vibrating with desperate anticipation. "Good evening, everyone," Elias began, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the union of two remarkable individuals. But before I speak about the groom, I want to take a moment to speak about the bride." Elias turned his body slightly, looking directly at me. "Maya, you came to Sterling Enterprises 2 years ago. You walked into a boardroom full of seasoned executives and completely redefined what it means to lead. You are brilliant, you are ruthless, and you are operating with an unparalleled level of integrity." A murmur of agreement rippled through the front tables. I saw my father blink, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. He clearly didn't understand why Elias Sterling was talking about my career. "You have overseen our most aggressive multi-million-dollar acquisitions this year," Elias continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "And you have done it flawlessly. You are my top senior director. But more importantly, you have become family. I could not have handpicked a better partner for my son." The confusion on my father's face melted into pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly turned his head, looking from Elias to me and finally to the man sitting beside me. Elias smiled and turned his gaze to Julian. "Julian," Elias said, his voice softening with deep fatherly pride, "you decided years ago that you wanted to build your own legacy. You used your mother's maiden name. You went into the inner city and built programs that actually changed lives. You wanted to prove that you were a man of character, not just a man with a trust fund. And you have proven that beyond a shadow of a doubt." Elias raised his glass, sweeping his gaze across the entire room. He deliberately let his eyes rest on the back row for a fraction of a second. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias announced, his voice booming with triumphant finality, "please join me in raising a glass to my brilliant senior director, Maya, and my only son, the sole heir to the Sterling Empire, Julian Sterling." The room erupted into thunderous applause. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked straight at Rosie. Chloe's jaw had literally dropped open. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale against the stark white lace of her inappropriate gown. She was staring at Julian as if he had just grown a second head. All evening she had been snickering about his broke charity worker salary. All last night she had laughed while my father mocked him. Now the realization was hitting her like a freight train. Her sister hadn't just married well, her sister had married into a dynasty. Liam looked physically ill. He slumped back in his chair, his hand covering his mouth. He had spent the entire morning making passive-aggressive comments about Julian needing predatory loans to afford this venue. He had practically demanded Julian bow to his old money status. And now he realized he had been insulting the sole heir to the sterling fortune to his face. But it was Calvin who looked the most destroyed. My father sat perfectly still, his eyes wide and vacant. His brain was short-circuiting. The man he had begged to meet, the man he thought would save his corporate career, was his new father-in-law. The nobody he had insulted at the rehearsal dinner was the billionaire's son. And the daughter he had abandoned, the daughter he had told to walk alone because she was an embarrassment, was the senior director orchestrating the buyout of his firm. He had played his hand perfectly, and he had lost absolutely everything. The applause gradually subsided as Elias handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and took his seat beside me. The string orchestra smoothly transitioned into a vibrant, upbeat jazz piece, but the energy in the room had permanently shifted. The air crackled with electric excitement. My colleagues from Sterling Enterprises were raising their glasses in our direction, nodding with profound respect. I turned to Julian, who gave me a brilliant, satisfied smile. We had just detonated a social atomic bomb, and the fallout was magnificent to watch. I directed my gaze across the dance floor toward the very back of the room. Row Z was in a state of absolute chaos. Brenda was frantically fanning herself with a wedding program, her face blotchy and red. My father, Calvin, had completely collapsed forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. The corporate titan he had planned to manipulate was now entirely out of his reach. But it was Liam who caught my attention next. Liam was standing up. His face was a tight mask of bruised ego and desperate arrogance. For a man born into perceived privilege, being suddenly relegated to the bottom of the social hierarchy was an intolerable offense. Liam could not handle the fact that Julian, the man he had spent the entire weekend mocking as a broke charity worker, was actually the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. Instead of accepting his defeat quietly, Liam decided his best course of action was to assert his dominance. I truly believed his fading old money name was a universal VIP pass. I watched him grab Chloe by the wrist and yank her out of her chair. Chloe stumbled, her heavy white lace bridal gown tangling around her ankles as Liam dragged her aggressively across the room. She looked terrified, aware that she was wearing a wedding dress to a reception where she had just been publicly outed as a cruel sister. But Liam did not care about her embarrassment. He marched straight across the dance floor, bypassing the designated guest boundaries and headed directly for table 1. Julian saw them coming and shifted slightly in his chair, leaning closer to me. "Here comes the desperate recovery attempt," Julian whispered, his tone laced with dark amusement. Liam pushed past 2 of our senior board members without excusing himself, planting his feet directly in front of Elias Sterling. He completely ignored me. He completely ignored Julian. His entire focus was locked on the billionaire CEO. "Mr. Sterling," Liam announced, projecting his voice so the surrounding tables could hear him. "I am Liam Pemberton. I believe my father runs in similar circles up in Boston. I just wanted to welcome you properly and introduce myself." Liam extended his right hand, displaying that same outdated scuffed Rolex watch. Elias did not stand up. He did not immediately take Liam's hand. Elias simply leaned back in his leather dining chair, slowly swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He let Liam stand there with his hand suspended in the air for 5 agonizing seconds, forcing Liam to feel the acute awkwardness of his uninvited interruption. Finally, Elias reached out and gave Liam a single firm shake before releasing his grip. "Pemberton," Elias said, his voice a low, smooth rumble. "Yes, the name is familiar." Liam visibly puffed out his chest, taking the acknowledgement as a massive victory. His arrogant smirk returned in full force. Chloe stood slightly behind him, nervously smoothing the pearl embellishments on her bodice, trying to look like she belonged at the head table. "It is a small world at the top," Liam bragged, leaning casually against the edge of our table. "My family has been a cornerstone of the northeastern financial sector for generations. The Pemberton Trust manages a highly diversified portfolio. Legacy capital, you know how it is. It takes a certain kind of sophistication to navigate generational wealth." Liam then made his fatal mistake. He turned his smug gaze toward Julian. "I have to say I was surprised by the announcement tonight." Liam chuckled, shaking his head. "Julian here has been playing the starving non-profit worker for so long, we all just assumed he was avoiding the real corporate world. It is good to see he is finally stepping up to join the adults. Running a youth center is cute, but managing a real empire takes actual pedigree." The silence that fell over table 1 was absolute. The senior executives seated around us stopped eating. They stared at Liam with expressions of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. This man had just walked up to the founder of Sterling Enterprises and insulted his only son to his face. I felt a cold, dangerous thrill run down my spine. Liam had just handed Elias the exact opening he needed. Elias set his glass down on the table. The soft clink of the crystal against the wood sounded like a gavel striking a block. "Pedigree," Elias repeated, tasting the word as if it were poison. "That is an interesting choice of words, Liam. Tell me, how exactly is the Pemberton Trust performing these days?" Liam adjusted his suet jacket, his smile faltering slightly at the sudden shift in Elias's tone. "Oh, we are doing exceptionally well. We have substantial holdings in commercial real estate up and down the East Coast. My father manages the primary investments. We like to keep our capital quietly working for us." "Is that right?" Elias asked, his voice rising in volume, ensuring that every single corporate executive at the surrounding tables could hear him perfectly. "Because my firm recently finalized the aggressive acquisition of Vanguard Asset Management in Boston. As part of our due diligence, we ran a comprehensive audit on their largest accounts. The Pemberton Trust was one of them." Liam stopped breathing. The arrogant smirk vanished, completely replaced by a look of stark, sudden terror. Chloe looked between Liam and Elias, her brow furrowing in confusion. Elias stood up slowly, unfolding his tall, imposing frame until he was looking down at Liam. "You talk a lot about legacy capital," Liam Elias stated, his voice echoing across the silent dining area. "So you must be aware that your father leveraged your family's historical assets against a series of toxic commercial properties over the last 10 years. You must be aware that those properties completely tanked. In fact, according to the audit sitting on my desk right now, the Pemberton Trust is currently underwater by exactly $14.2 million. A collective gasp erupted from the tables nearby. The corporate sharks around us were wide-eyed, whispering furiously to one another. That is confidential information." Liam stammered, his face turning an alarming shade of pale gray. "You cannot discuss that here. There has been a misunderstanding with the numbers." "There is no misunderstanding," Elias replied coldly. "Your family is entirely bankrupt. You are living on revolving credit and the rapidly decaying illusion of a name that lost its value a decade ago. Your trust cannot even generate enough liquid cash to cover the basic maintenance taxes on your properties." Chloe grabbed Liam's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his suit jacket. "Liam, what is he talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "What does he mean we are bankrupt? You said the trust was secure. You said we were buying a summer home next year." Liam tried to shake her off, but his hands were trembling violently. "Shut up, Chloe," he hissed through his teeth. "Just shut up." But Elias was not finished. He leaned in closer, resting his hands on the table and delivering the final killing blow. "We are not just auditing the accounts," Liam Elias said, delivering the facts with brutal surgical precision. "We are liquidating them. Sterling Enterprises is moving to seize the Pemberton primary estate next month to cover the outstanding debts your father owes to the management firm we just bought. Your family is losing the house, Liam. You have absolutely nothing left." Chloe let out a loud, horrified sob. The reality was crashing down on her with the force of a tidal wave. She had spent the entire day acting superior. She had paraded around my venue in a white wedding gown, trying to prove she was better than me because she married into old money. Now she was standing in front of hundreds of people, realizing she was shackled to massive, crippling debt, while her older sister had just married a billionaire. "You do not get to walk up to my table and insult my son." Elias finished, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You do not get to speak about pedigree when you are weeks away from an eviction notice. Now take your wife and walk away before I have security throw you out into the street." Liam was completely destroyed. His ego, his status, and his entire identity had just been publicly obliterated by the most powerful man in the room. He could not form a single word of defense. He spun around and practically ran toward the exit, leaving Chloe standing alone in her ridiculous white lace gown. Chloe let out a wail of pure humiliation. She gathered the heavy skirts of her dress and sprinted across the dance floor, chasing after her broke, disgraced husband as the entire room watched them flee. The sound of their frantic footsteps faded, leaving behind a room full of staring, whispering guests. I raised my champagne glass, tapping it gently against Julian's. The financial checkmate was complete, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The string orchestra shifted into a lively, celebratory rhythm, effectively washing away the awkward tension Liam had tried to infect the room with. Julian leaned over and kissed my cheek, his hand resting securely on my waist. I whispered to him that I needed a brief moment to catch my breath and retrieve something important. He nodded, his eyes warm and completely understanding. I signaled to Terrence, my head of security, who was standing discreetly near the grand staircase. Terrence fell into step behind me as I made my way to the venue's private office. He unlocked the master safe and handed me the heavy black leather document portfolio I had secured there earlier that morning. I thanked him and instructed him to give me a few minutes of privacy on the outdoor garden terrace. I knew exactly who was waiting for me out there. The evening air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine. The terrace was bathed in the soft glow of string lights woven through the ancient oak trees. I walked slowly toward the stone balustrade overlooking the manicured lawns, taking a deep, steadying breath. "Maya." The voice was weak, trembling, and stripped of every single ounce of the booming, arrogant authority it usually commanded. I turned around. My father Calvin stepped out from the shadows of the garden path. He looked utterly destroyed. The expensive custom-tailored suit he had spent hours pressing this morning hung loosely on his shoulders, as if his body had physically shrunk. His silk tie was completely undone, hanging limply around his neck. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. The man who had mocked my future husband, who had refused to walk me down the aisle, who had demanded I push my guest to the back of the room to serve his corporate ambitions, was now standing before me completely broken. "Maya, please," Calvin stammered, closing the distance between us. He stopped a few feet away, seemingly afraid to step any closer. "I did not know. I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea who Elias Sterling actually was to you. I did not know Julian was his son. If you had just told me the truth about them. If I had just told you what Dad," I asked, my voice calm, steady, and devoid of any sympathy. "If I had told you that Julian was a billionaire's heir, would you have treated him with basic human decency? Would you have refrained from humiliating him at the rehearsal dinner? Would you have actually bothered to walk your eldest daughter down the aisle instead of abandoning her for Chloe's fragile ego?" Calvin swallowed hard, his eyes darting back and forth. "You know how the corporate world works, Maya. I was under an immense amount of pressure. This buyout has been hanging over my head for months. I was desperate to save my career, to save our family's lifestyle. I made a mistake. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. But you have to understand, I am your father." I took a hesitant step forward, raising his hands in a pleading gesture. "Maya, you have his ear!" Calvin begged, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Elias Sterling listens to you. He stood up there and said you are his top senior director. He said you are family. You can fix this. You can talk to him for me. Just put in a good word. Tell him I am a dedicated vice president. Tell him my division is profitable. If you just ask him to spare my job during the restructuring, he will do it. You have to save me, Maya. Please. If I lose this position, I lose my pension. I lose everything." I looked at the man, sweating and shivering in the warm evening breeze. He was not apologizing for hurting me. He was not apologizing for making me feel invisible my entire life. He was only apologizing because he had accidentally insulted the people holding his paycheck. I was still trying to use me as a networking tool, just like he had tried to use my wedding reception. I unclasped the heavy black leather portfolio I was holding in my hands. "You do not need to speak to Elias Sterling about your position, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chillingly professional register. "Elias does not handle the micro-level restructuring of the logistics acquisitions. He delegates that to the senior director overseeing the audit." Calvin blinked, his bloodshot eyes widening in profound confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for the past 8 months, my dedicated acquisitions team has been running a comprehensive, deeply exhaustive forensic audit on your specific corporate division," I explained, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact. "I am the executive who processed your branch's financials. I am the one who reviewed your leadership metrics." I pulled the thick manila folder from the portfolio and held it out to him. Calvin's trembling hands reached out and took it. "Open it," I commanded quietly. He fumbled with the string closure, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the entire file. When he finally flipped it open, his eyes scanned the top document. It was the finalized executive summary of the restructuring plan. It bore my official signature at the bottom. "During my audit, Dad, I found a deeply entrenched pattern of toxic management," I stated, delivering the facts with brutal surgical precision. "I found inflated expense reports that bordered on embezzlement. I found a documented history of unethical vendor practices that you personally signed off on to artificially inflate your quarterly margins. You built your entire corporate reputation on smoke and mirrors, stepping on your subordinates to make yourself look taller." Calvin was gasping for air now, his eyes darting frantically across the devastating words on the paper. The document detailed his professional execution perfectly. "Elias does not make the final call on the regional management cuts." I continued, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing right in front of him. "I do. And I submitted my finalized executive recommendation to the board yesterday afternoon. I recommended that your entire tier of management be eliminated due to systemic financial inefficiency." Mayano Calvin choked out, tears actually pooling in his eyes. "You cannot do this to your own father. I also explicitly noted that your termination should be processed immediately and without a severance package." I added, my tone absolute and unforgiving. Given the documented ethical violations in your reporting, the company is legally protected from paying you a single cent in exit compensation. Your pension is currently frozen pending a secondary internal review, and your corporate expense accounts were permanently deactivated at 6 o'clock this evening. The file slipped from his hands, falling onto the stone patio with a heavy final thud. Papers spilled across the ground, scattering the undeniable proof of his total destruction. Calvin fell to his knees, his hands covering his face as a ragged, pathetic sob tore through his chest. He had spent his entire life bullying me, dismissing my accomplishments, and telling me I was not good enough. He had stood in the foyer of this very venue just hours ago and told me not to embarrass him. He had demanded I bow down to wealth. I looked down at the broken man weeping on the stones. "You wanted to know how to act around real wealth, Dad," I said, my voice carrying the steady, unshakable power of a woman who had finally claimed her crown. "It starts with integrity. You are fired." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not wait for him to beg or negotiate or try to manipulate me one last time. I simply turned my back on him. I walked away from the shadows of the garden, stepping back into the warm, brilliant light of the ballroom. The music was playing, the champagne was flowing, and my husband was waiting for me on the dance floor. I left my father exactly where he belonged, kneeling in the dark, entirely alone. 6 months slipped by in a beautiful, uninterrupted sequence of peace. Atlanta might be a sprawling metropolis, but the elite commercial real estate circle operates like a very small town. The story of my wedding reception spread through those executive networks like a wildfire fueled by gasoline. I never had to say a single word in my own defense. The hundreds of corporate executives and industry titans who had attended my reception did all the talking for me. They had watched my father fall to his knees in the garden. They had watched Liam get verbally dismantled by Elias Sterling. The truth was out, and the consequences were absolute. My father's corporate execution happened precisely as I had orchestrated it. Bright and early that Monday morning, Elias processed the termination. There was no negotiation. There was no golden parachute to soften the blow. My father was escorted out of his office building by corporate security, holding a cardboard box containing whatever dignity he had left. But the loss of his paycheck was only the beginning of his punishment. Calvin immediately tried to leverage his country club connections to find another executive role. He called every favor he thought he was owed. He reached out to men he had played golf with for a decade. Every single door was slammed in his face. Nobody wanted to hire a disgraced vice president whose complete lack of integrity had been publicly exposed by the most powerful chief executive officer in the sector. The country club quietly asked him to resign his membership when his dues bounced. He was forced to sell his luxury vehicles just to keep up with the mortgage on a suburban house he could no longer afford. He spent his days sitting in a quiet house, realizing that he had sacrificed his relationship with his most successful daughter for a job he ended up losing anyway. The man who had mocked my husband for his nonprofit salary was now entirely locked out of the corporate world he used to worship. The destruction of the Pemberton Family Trust was even more spectacular to witness. Sterling Enterprises moved forward with the asset seizure exactly as Elias had promised. The holding company was liquidated, and Liam's family lost everything to cover the massive hidden debts his father had accumulated. The Pemberton name, once synonymous with old money prestige, became a cautionary tale of financial ruin discussed over expensive cocktails. Liam lost his trust fund, his properties, and his unearned, arrogant swagger. He went from bragging about his pedigree to having his premium credit cards declined at restaurants. Naturally, the money vanished. The supposed fairy tale marriage my parents had praised so highly, completely dissolved. Chloe did not marry Liam for love or partnership. She married him for status. When that status was legally repossessed, she filed for a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce. The local blogs and gossip circles had a field day watching her drag Liam through the courts, fighting viciously over the last remaining scraps of a lifestyle they could no longer maintain. Chloe was actually forced to sell her designer handbags and the ridiculous white lace gown she wore to my wedding on internet resale sites just to afford the retainer fees for a decent divorce attorney. Without her rich husband to hide behind, Chloe had to move back into my parents' guest room. She returned to the house carrying nothing but mounting legal bills, a ruined reputation, and the bitter realization that she had thrown away her relationship with me for a man who had absolutely nothing to offer her. With my father unemployed, and my sister going through a humiliating public divorce, the illusion of my mother's perfect family was entirely shattered. Brenda could no longer brag to her friends about her golden child. She could no longer look down on anyone. The carefully constructed hierarchy she had used to terrorize me for 35 years had collapsed under its own toxic weight. Her social circle abandoned her the moment the lavish dinners and status updates stopped. That is when the phone calls started. Brenda began leaving me long, tearful voicemails. She did not apologize for demanding I walk down the aisle alone. She did not apologize for threatening to boycott my wedding photos or for trying to humiliate me on the most important day of my life. Instead, she weaponized her tears. She cried into the phone about how hard things were for my father and how much Chloe was struggling with her heartbreak. She left desperate messages saying that family needs to stick together during difficult times and that we needed to let the past go so we could heal. She actually expected me to swoop in with my newly secured wealth and my connections to save them from the consequences of their own terrible actions. I sat in my spacious corner office at Sterling Enterprises, listening to my mother's voice waver with manufactured grief. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the desperate, anxious urge to fix their problems like I would have a decade ago. I simply felt nothing for them at all. I pressed delete on the final voicemail, erasing her voice from my life. Then I picked up my office phone and called my cellular service provider. I requested a brand new personal phone number. I did not leave a forwarding contact. I did not send a final goodbye text. I severed the last remaining thread connecting me to their dysfunction and walked away into a future they would never be allowed to touch. I stepped out onto the sprawling stone terrace of the new estate Julian and I had purchased just outside the city limits. The evening air was warm and heavy with the sweet, comforting scent of magnolia blossoms. I held a crystal glass of sparkling cider in my hand, taking a long, deep breath as I looked out over the rolling green hills that sloped down toward a private, serene lake. This was my home. It was not a place built on the toxic foundations of pretending to be someone I was not. It was a sanctuary built on mutual respect, hard work, and absolute integrity. Just yesterday afternoon, the board of directors at Sterling Enterprises had called me into the main executive suite. Elias sat at the head of the long mahogany table, smiling with that familiar, quiet pride. They did not just congratulate me on the flawless execution of the logistics firm buyout. They handed me a brand new contract. I was officially promoted to Executive Vice President of Acquisitions. I had broken through every single glass ceiling my biological family had ever told me I would bounce off of. I was 35 years old, a powerful black woman in commercial real estate, and I held the keys to an empire. I turned my attention back to the terrace. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees as laughter drifted over from the outdoor dining pavilion. Julian was standing by the stone fire pit, tossing a piece of cedar into the glowing orange flames. The firelight caught the edge of his wedding band, glinting brightly in the dusk. He looked up, caught me watching him, and flashed that incredible, deeply reassuring smile that had anchored me through the absolute worst days of my life. He excused himself from his conversation and walked over to me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there together, looking at the people gathered on our patio. Elias was sitting in a comfortable lounge chair holding court with my three best friends. Tasha, Keisha, and Jasmine were laughing hysterically at a story Elias was telling about his early days in the real estate business. There was no posturing here. There was no desperate need to perform wealth or demonstrate class superiority. There was simply joy, authenticity, and profound connection. These were the people who had stood like an impenetrable fortress around me, when the people who shared my DNA tried to tear me down to the studs. For over 3 decades, I had run myself ragged trying to earn a seat at my parents' table. I had believed the lie that familial love was a transactional currency, something I had to constantly purchase with my compliance, my silence, and my willingness to make myself smaller so my sister Chloe could feel tall. I thought about the little girl I used to be crying in her childhood bedroom, wondering why her father never looked at her with pride, and why her mother only saw her as an inconvenient shadow. The contrast between my past and my present was breathtaking. Right now, Calvin was sitting in a foreclosed suburban house, drafting desperate cover letters for executive jobs he would never, ever get. Brenda was completely isolated, mourning the loss of a social circle that had evaporated the very second the money dried up. Chloe was drowning in legal fees, fighting a messy, highly publicized divorce against Liam, a white man with a bankrupt trust fund and a shattered ego. They had traded their dignity for the illusion of status, and in the end, they were left with absolutely nothing. They had worshipped a hollow image, and that image had completely collapsed on top of them. I leaned back against Julian's solid chest, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of his heart against my spine. I realized then that the universe has a profoundly beautiful way of removing the things that block your light. My father refusing to walk me down the aisle was not a tragedy. It was a formal eviction notice to the pain of my past. My mother's cruel ultimatum in the bridal suite was not a punishment. It was the key to my ultimate unshakable freedom. They had tried to push me into the dark, completely unaware that I was already building my own sun. Family is not about blood. Blood is just a biological coincidence. True family is about who stands beside you when the heavy oak doors open and the terrifying weight of the world is staring you in the face. Family is the people who refuse to let you walk alone. They are the ones who hand you the sword when you are facing a battle, and they are the ones who help you carry the crown when the victory is won. I did not just survive my family's betrayal. I did not just weather the storm of their deeply rooted jealousy and their pathetic classist manipulations. I took the heavy stones they threw at me, I ground them into dust, and I used them to lay the unbreakable foundation of my own kingdom. I built an empire on the ashes of their disrespect. And as I raised my glass to the beautiful, brilliant people laughing on my terrace, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that my reign had only just begun. The greatest lesson I learned is that true family is never defined by bloodline or obligation. Your actual worth is not determined by those who blindly tear you down to elevate themselves. True strength comes from recognizing your own value, walking away from toxic manipulation, and building an empire on the ashes of their disrespect. You deserve to be surrounded by people who proudly stand beside you, not those who hide you in the shadows. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with toxic relatives? Share your journey in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories.